Welcome to our inaugural lecture of our TZION series. Our talk, Zionism in the 21st Century, is, as I mentioned, part of a larger series called the TZION series, which is really something that's new for us this semester. And it is sort of the brainchild, in fact, of David Starr's, who's working to get this program TZION off the ground. Dr. Starr comes to us from Boston. He was a former vice president of Boston Hebrew College. And there at Hebrew College, he worked to found the MEA program. I know many people in Cleveland have heard of the MEA program. It started in Boston and continues until today. I had the privilege of teaching in the MEA program. Is really a very important piece of adult learning in the Boston area and was brought to Cleveland as well. And now Dr. Starr is working on TZION to follow some of the same rigorous methods that we had with the MEA program, really to encourage Jewish literacy around Zionism and the history of Israel and culture and society and contemporary culture and society. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you for this first lecture this evening. And of course, I know all of you have probably seen our advertisements for our upcoming lectures as well. We have one scheduled for October, one for November, one for December, and I'm working on scheduling for the spring. But our next one is a month from today, October 30th, Israel Still Jewish and Democratic, with Professor Doron Kalir. In the meantime, please help me welcome Dr. Rabbi David Starr for our initial lecture this evening. Please give a warm Cleveland welcome.
I'm so mic'd up here. I'm having a hard time figuring out where I leave off and where technology begins. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to Brian and Alana for having me. Alana made a wonderful introduction as far as TZION goes, so I'm not sure that I want to say a whole lot more about it, except to say that, I think that Israel, Zionism and Israel are arguably the most important story in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, and I think we need to know a lot more about it. People who work in the Jewish community invest a lot of energy in trying to draw people closer to Israel, but for the most part, we sometimes skip steps in terms of we assume that people are going to feel a strong tie to Israel historically, familially, emotionally, tribally. And I think, it's the case that for most people in the 20th or 21st century, it's hard to feel connected to something when you don't know it that well. So I created TZION to try to help people draw closer to something, to Israel and Zionism, both intellectually and then I hope in some deep personal way as well. So it's great to be working on this with Brian and Alana, and I'm excited to be here. So let me just set this aside. So I chose as a topic for tonight Zionism in the 21st century. What would Herzl say? And I chose that because over a century ago, he wrote a utopian novel, Old Neuland, Alt Neuland in the original German, in which he did something that in some ways was not so unusual for the time, which was to write a utopian novel and sort of dream out loud, as it were. But unlike a lot of the other utopian novels, probably the most famous one, I guess, of that time, looking backward, was clearly utopian in the sense that there was something very much kind of otherworldly about it. Herzl was not only dreaming, but he was planning, he was working, he was building, he was leading, he was speaking, and he was really building something. And so that which he that which he was simultaneously dreaming and writing about, he was also speaking and building and leading about. And what's striking is the things that he focused upon the most in the novel, which I'll start doing the slides in a second, are arguably still the things that can guide us best in terms of thinking about contemporary Israel. What it's accomplished, what it struggled with, what it continues to struggle with, and things that arguably are going to continue to be significant issues for the state and society of Israel today. So I thought it would be fun, in effect, to kind of toggle back and forth between past and present, which is in effect really what he was doing. And unfortunately, and I kept forgetting to ask Brian this, there is, first of all, how many of you have read Old New Land? Okay, so just a couple. Everybody should read it, number one. And number two, I want to put in a plug for a particular edition, which I kept meaning to ask you if you owned. There's an edition that was published in Haifa in 1959 in many languages: English, German, French, Hebrew, maybe others, but those are the ones for sure, because I've seen editions of those, which in effect really shows from Israel of 1959 how his promise, vision, dream, work in progress had actually come true. So it's a wonderful edition because it really shows you Israel of the 1950s against the backdrop of his words and his vision. So again, I urge you all to read the novel. It's not a very good book in the sense of the characters are kind of flat, the plot is a little bit simple. He wasn't doing it to try to be Proust or Joyce or Kafka, but he was doing it really for other purposes, namely galvanizing people around this vision of what he thought Zionism could actually build. And what's remarkable is how much of it came true. Ha! The founder himself. This is kind of a funky little poster of Herzl. As many of you may know, Zionism, like all nationalisms, was very into its own iconography. Right? It had a very strong sense that the visual would be a significant way of sort of creating a kind of a word picture for people and imagining what this thing could look like. Of course, what's remarkable, what's cute about this picture, of course, is that you have a person, a real European Jew, an urban Jew from Budapest, who had spent time in Vienna, of course, most famously in Paris. He was a journalist during the Dreyfus Affair. But he's really a kind of a Central Eastern European Jew, well-educated, has a law degree, very much comfortable with progressive technocratic Europe. But of course, the poster puts him smack dab in the middle of the Middle East. And that's, of course, a clue to a core aspect of his vision, which was in many ways building a kind of an European technocratic paradise in the Middle East. So this sort of picks up on that. So here's a little bit of his context, which brings us back to how remarkable a success Zionism was when they held their first Congress in 1897 in Basel. This was a movement that was really opposed by virtually all of the major segments of Jewish society at the time. Of course, the Orthodox opposed it because it was overwhelmingly a secular phenomenon. Reform rabbis opposed it because it was breaking with this whole notion of the mission of Jews as being in the diaspora, and a religious mission at that. Secular liberals opposed it because it was anti-assimilationist. And socialists opposed it because it was non-socialist, although, of course, that would quickly change with the second Aliyah. But by 1902, I mean, 5 years after the first Congress, what they had built, what was called in Hebrew Hamedinah Baderach, the state in the making, most of the pieces that would enable the building of the pre-statehood, in effect proto-state in society, were already in place. They had annual congresses, they had dues-paying members in all these different countries, they had an executive committee that was elected by the Congress and answerable to them, so that was a kind of like a proto-politics. They had newspapers, both a kind of a world newspaper, but also regional and local papers. They were already selling bonds and shares as a way of raising money to buy land. I mean, not just that, but mainly that. Herzl initially wanted to write this novel. He was encouraged by a fin de siècle French author named Alphonse Daudet, and he said, oh, you know, you should write a novel sort of like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, of course, those of you who remember your Civil War history, was not only, I think, a wonderful novel, but had a huge impact on the entire course of antebellum history, infuriated Southern whites and really galvanized Northern whites. But Herzl lost his nerve for a while. He sort of let this dream go, and instead he tried reaching out to a couple of the major Jewish philanthropists of his time. Baron Hirsch, there's a picture here of a colony. Baron Hirsch sponsored colonies all over the Jewish world, including in America, places like New Jersey and the like, trying to help Jews become productive. That was one of the major themes of Zionism. And a lot of work, Jewish work, in the turn of the century, which was a kind of a critique of the fact that there was a sense, both from non-Jews as well as from Jews, that not enough Jews were productive. They didn't make things. They didn't farm. So even though Herzl was not all that interested in farming, because he was an urban Jew, he was much more interested in technocracy than farming, he did reach out to major philanthropists who were very interested in this theme of the productivization of Jews. Of course, the most famous of those philanthropists was Baron Rothschild. Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in Vineland, New Jersey.
There you go.
And Norma is just outside of Vineland, and Baron Rothschild.
That's right.
Set up a farm there.
That's right, and that was exactly a part of that story. So thank you for mentioning that.
Interestingly enough, it turned into a hachshara for the poet TZION, for people preparing to go to Israel.
Right. Good.
And it had a very strong influence on the Jewish life of Vineland.
Yeah. So, and Rothschild is the founder, probably most famously, of Zichron Yaakov, which is a moshava in northern Israel. He was trying to get Jews to do things like plant silk trees, and he sent his agronomists from Paris to help with this. So Herzl is trying initially to reach out to the philanthropists and to get them to jumpstart in a very dramatic way his vision. Of course, there's a picture on the right from the first Congress in Basel in 1897, and there that's a later poster of Herzl as a sort of a creator of the financial instrumentality of raising shekalim, of shekels for Israel, and the Histadrut as well. This is an example of two different things. The thing on the left, Die Welt, was the major Zionist newspaper, and on the right, the Judenstaat, which was the pamphlet that he wrote even before Altneuland, in which he lays out in a kind of a wonky way what he thinks Zionism needs to look like organizationally, politically, and otherwise to become a success. I mentioned before Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, but very quickly Alt-Neuland is published in 1902, and it quickly becomes a success. It's translated into, and you get just a sense from the languages of all the places that the Jews lived, Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino. Nachum Sokolov, the Hebrew translator, calls his version Tel Aviv. Sound familiar? Right? And the founders of what at the time was a suburb of Yafo, we think chose that name in part because of this reference. Alt-Neuland, this is the original German edition. He focuses there on 3 issues. The book is principally about 3 issues. The first is equal citizenship. In other words, what should the politics be? Civil society things. Second is social economic structure. And third is the issue of state and religion. And again, if you don't know anything else about the relationship between Zionism and Israel, these are 3 central things that you should think about, because these things were then important and they still are today. Equal citizenship. At the time, the notion of universal suffrage existed nowhere in the world except for New Zealand. Okay, so in other words, the idea of a person dreaming out loud about creating a society of universal suffrage was, it didn't exist in Mississippi, didn't exist in London, right? Women couldn't vote pretty much anywhere. And he has a character in the book, Rashid Bey, who's an Arab engineer from Haifa, who is a kind of an example, a literary example of what he's dreaming of, which is a society where Jews and Arabs will be equal citizens. The villain of the book is a bad rabbi named Dr. Geyer. Geyer in German means vulture. He is an example that Herzl knew very well from the politics of Vienna, and Karl Lueger, who was the mayor of Vienna for a time, and in Herzl's lifetime, who had run on an explicitly anti-Semitic platform, basically arguing that Viennese politics was being sort of damaged by liberals and by Jews in particular, and really openly promoting a kind of a Christian approach to politics. So Herzl basically takes that Viennese model of Lueger and he maps that on to the figure of Rabbi Geyer, who instead of promoting a Jewish and democratic state says, no, this should be a state for the Jews. It should be, in effect, an ethnocracy. Jews can be equal, but non-Jews can never be equal. This is the seal of New Zealand, and of course, what's the figure on the right that in effect models their vision of universal suffrage? The Aborigine. So this is the New Zealand seal. And of course, here's a picture of, this is today's Haifa, obviously. But this is what Jews and Arabs alike in the novel are building. This technocracy, and a figure like Rashid Bey, this Arab engineer, is one of the builders of course, this marvelous sense of, modern Haifa. Remember, of course, at the time, the 2 cities that Herzl really focused the most on, because Tel Aviv literally didn't exist, the 2 major cities in the novel are Haifa as the modern technocracy, the port city. No, and Jerusalem, the Jewish old city, the kind of the museum of the Jewish people. Tel Aviv is not really very present in the novel in that sense. There's a picture of Lueger on the left, and I got this. This is Geyer, a vulture from a German kind of nameplate on the right. So where does he get this vision of a liberal Zionism from? A Jewish and democratic state. As a good European, a well-educated European who had studied law, of course, he was heir to the European tradition of social democracy, universalism, and equal civil rights. It really went back to events like the French Revolution. But also in the novel, he draws selectively, because he's not a particularly learned Jew, but he does draw selectively from Jewish traditions that he understood as a kind of proto-democratic in their own way, one of which, of course, is one of the most famous lines in the Torah that also makes its way into the Haggadah. Remember that you were a stranger in the land of Egypt, and also you should have one law for you and for the stranger within your gates, meaning that, yes, there is some sense that people who are not like you are strangers, but the question is, what do you do with them? You make them into Ezrachim, you make them into citizens. And of course, the premise, therefore, is that even though democracy at some level had failed in Europe, and Jews were among the groups that had some sense of, at least those who are turning to movements like Zionism, who felt that, well, you know what, democracy is not really coming to full fruition in Europe, but it will come to full fruition here. So again, there's a utopian thrust to this, but the point is he doesn't want this to be utopian. He wants this for real. He wants to make this happen. What are some of the things that he missed? In other words, that he did, maybe he didn't, it's hard to criticize him for not seeing things that didn't exist in his time, but things that we need to be mindful of. Number one, of course, is that Arab nationalism really was born after he died. He died in 1904. And Arab nationalism is mostly, it begins in very modest ways prior to World War I, where Arabs begin to chafe inside of the Ottoman Empire, and the sort of small cohort of well-educated middle-class Arabs begin to, in effect, watch what's happening in Europe also, and they begin to sort of make moves towards Arab nationalism. And then World War I, of course, accelerates that process. The British encourage Arab nationalism as a way of undermining the Ottoman Empire. So he missed all that. He died too early, and he didn't see that necessarily happening. And of course, all the more so with Palestinian nationalism specifically and more locally. And of course, he also, he also was a person of his time and of his class and of his locale. And European thinkers in general, even people who are quite liberal and even socialist, were not thinking a lot about colonial national movements, meaning that the British were not taking that seriously in terms of the Raj, in terms of India, the French in North Africa. Even people who are quite to the left and even as late as post-World War II, French socialists, for example, only belatedly come to take things like Vietnamese independence seriously. So to the extent that Herzl really didn't see this happening in what was then the Ottoman Empire, it's not a question of excusing it, it's a question of just putting him in his context. Here's a picture of early Arab nationalists. Of course, you see some people with the fez on, but of course, many of these fellows were well-educated, studying law and the like. You can see they already look very much Europeanized. Okay, so how did Zionism build upon Herzl's vision of equal rights, this Jewish and democratic state vision? The first thing, of course, is that they do give citizenship to Arabs, which includes voting rights. Arabic becomes the, in effect, second language of the state, and an Arabic language state school system is constructed, which devotes some time to Arabic culture, and history. By the way, this is an extremely, I would still say that even though there is something, I think, very important about actually realizing this vision of equal rights through separate school systems, you could also make a very powerful argument that it was a disaster in terms of integrating Israeli Arabs into a larger Israeli identity, and that to the extent that Israel is balkanized because of all these different school systems, they should have had one. It's very interesting to think about how different Israel would be if there were only one school system as opposed to one for the religious community, one for the Haredi community, one for the Arab community, one for the secular Jewish community. So, something to think about. Of course, democracy is very fragile. And again, we should we should remember always the larger context. Even in American democracy, the fragility of it can be understood by what was done to the Japanese Americans in World War II. It's hard to have a multi-ethnic democracy. And usually major strains will, by definition, put that at jeopardy, and this is one of the real black moments in the history of American democracy. What are some of the 21st century challenges to Israeli democracy? There has been a lot of activity in the Knesset in the last few years that attempts to limit Arab rights. This is an ongoing issue. To the extent that the Israeli court system has been a pretty consistent protector of Arab rights and democracy, there have been counter moves in the Knesset to limit judicial review and to, in effect, defang the court. Remember, of course, Israel doesn't have a constitution, which means that the Knesset, in that sense, has a lot of power to really affect in ways that we would not necessarily recognize from the United States. In fact, there was just an article in the Times on Sunday about the fact that even though Obama has had all kinds of problems dealing with the Congress, he's appointed a lot of appellate court judges. And that's all a part of what we recognize intuitively from our American space as checks and balances, separation of powers. That's much less true in Israel because you don't have a constitution. So the attempt of the Knesset to change or whittle away at democracy is a much more real, it seems to me, threat to the Jewish and democratic vision. It's something that's worth talking about. And of course, those of you who have spent any time in Israel or read Israeli papers know that there's much more open anti-Arab sentiment in terms of public discourse now, especially in right-wing parties. Some of that you saw in terms of in the Gaza war. And by the way, I'm not saying anything that's particularly controversial. People in the Israeli public sector who speak openly against the Arab community, they clearly are not embarrassed about this. Otherwise, they wouldn't be speaking publicly about it. So what I'm saying is very uncontroversial. You shouldn't think that I'm editorializing here. Okay, so that's category number one, which is the Jewish and democratic state. What will the Jewish state be politically? Category number two is what he called the new society. He was a European liberal, so he thought in fairly conventional terms. He wasn't a socialist on the one end, he wasn't an aristocrat on the other. So he was fairly comfortable with capitalism, but he also didn't like it. He wasn't a kind of a free marketeer. He thought it was kind of inefficient. He really wanted this new society that he writes about in Alt Neuland. He really wants it to be what he calls what he calls mutualism, meaning he wants it to be a blending of the best of capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other hand. The capitalist virtues that he really prized were freedom and initiative, what we would call sort of an innovation culture. And what he prized most from socialism was its focus on equality and justice. So he's already writing about this in a play. He was really a frustrated writer in many ways and a playwright. He writes a play called Das Neue Ghetto, The New Ghetto, in which one of the negative themes in the play is the owner of a coal mine who is taking advantage of his workers, abusing his workers. So he clearly has a sense that capitalism in the radical free market sort of Milton Friedman-esque sense is problematic. Capitalism needs to be regulated. It's not all bad, but it's not all good. That's the Hebrew version on the left. So what would the new society look like? Lands would be public, natural resources also. Employees would own major industries and agricultural settlements. Retail would be private, right? Meaning you walk down the street in Tel Aviv, you want to buy yourself a sweater. Where do you go? You go to a store on Sderot Rothschild or Allenby, and that store is owned by a person. It's private. It's not a part of this socialist piece. But also you have this whole panoply of free social services. Education is free, medical care is free, old age pensions, old age homes, all of that is provided by the state. There was no military service. This is one of the more utopian aspects of the novel, because he hoped that the state, that this society would have been ratified by international treaty and the Ottomans as well. But there was national service in ways that people like, figures like President Kennedy, President Clinton talked about some notion of almost like a Peace Corps or a service corps, where people would give 2 years of service at the age of 18, and they could be teachers or instructors or sanitation workers, nurses, caregivers, and the like, each one contributing their own unique talents to this new society. What are some of the things that in some ways you could imagine as fitting into this vision? Of course, probably most famously, the kibbutz, right? The most radical collective phenomenon in first the yishuv and then in the state. Of course, notice the dances that they dance, the songs they sing, the games they play are in the round, right? Reinforcing all the time the group, the collective. No stock exchange in Herzl's vision. This is a picture, of course, from the real Israeli stock exchange, which you could sort of transpose to New York or Chicago. But he had no stock exchange. He didn't want an economy that would be significantly built around this thing called speculation and speculators. He regarded them, as do many of us, as mischief makers. More interested in making money on paper than actually building things. So that was the way he thought about it. So there's no stock exchange in the book. Now, the Yishuv, for those of you who know anything about the history of Israel, know that much of this came true in some ways for pragmatic reasons more than for philosophical or idealistic reasons. There were large-scale land purchases, and there was a need for credit to do that, and for that, you couldn't really rely upon private enterprise because there weren't enough Jews there. They had to pool resources to create enough scale in terms of their purchasing power to make these things happen. So they built a system that was very much focused around the social solidarity of everyone in the Yishuv and a pretty egalitarian wage system. One part ideology, one part pragmatism. And then, of course, they had to deal with the problem/opportunity of mass immigration, both before the war in terms of when the Yekas come, when the German Jews come, and then after the war when the Mizrahim come from Iraq, Yemen, and the like. And for that, private enterprise was not going to make that happen. And I should just tell you as an aside, since you're all Ohioans here, your great Senator Robert Taft, who was about as anti-New Deal as they came, Robert Taft supported public housing because he said, look, you know what? The private market should build enough housing for everybody, but it doesn't. It just doesn't. And he said openly, he was a very open-minded person intellectually in many ways. He said, I don't understand why it doesn't, but it doesn't, and that's why we need public housing. So he was really cluing into what was true in Israel as well, which is you needed a strong public sector to build things that the private sector at that point in Israeli society could not or would not generate. So here's just a wonderful little poster from this sort of the power of the Histadrut, this collective federation of labor unions, which had a huge role to play in the building out of first the proto-state economy and then in the state. Of course, notice that there's a kind of a Soviet element in terms of the theme, and that's very common in a lot of Israeli iconography, the 20s, the 30s. It looks very Soviet because, of course, a lot of these people were committed leftists, and they were very comfortable with the idea that says the left will build a just society, and it will build what we need in terms of economic strength and social solidarity. Here's a little kibbutz. These are kids who came from Lodz, from Poland. Okay, what's happened to that vision? Many of you know, the two people who wrote this book are friends of mine. I officiated the wedding of one of them, Saul Singer and Dan Senor, who wrote Startup Nation. Of course, what's happened to Israel is that it has become much more interested in market economy values. There is now a stock exchange, as that picture a few slides ago showed. Of course, many industries have become privatized. Public lands have been sold to private people. Medical care has become privatized to some degree, meaning people can buy out of the Kupat Cholim. In other words, if you go there and you're wealthy enough that you can buy private health care, you can do so. And of course, many people, not all by any means, but some people opt to do that. And of course, surprise, surprise, with all of this free marketeering, there's much more income inequality. Capitalism historically, I think it will come as no surprise to you, is very good at generating wealth. It is less good at distributing it. And what was it, 2 years ago, 2 summers ago, 3 summers ago? There were large demonstrations in Tel Aviv specifically. I forget if it happened in other cities too. Tel Aviv was by far the best publicized, of kids feeling like, look, you know what, the social contract of Israel was supposed to be and continue to be very much this kind of mutualist vision of Herzl's. And you know what, we can't buy apartments. We can't get jobs that pay enough to help us buy apartments. So in the sense of the expectation around what Israel was supposed to be as a society and economy, those expectations are sort of fraying at the edges. So this, I think, is a very interesting challenge for Israel in the present and moving forward. Here's a picture of a wonderful moshav. But moshavim, which were these interesting examples of public and private, they pooled their resources. They were kind of collective. They were sort of cooperative farms. Moshavim have become much more privatized as well. So that's category number 2. category number 3, of course, in some ways, is the most Jewish conflict of all, which is what will be the relationship between religion and state. Which is, in some ways, another way of asking even a more fundamental question, which is, what is Jewish about Israel? So this is the pamphlet that he writes before Alt-Neuland, the Judenstaat, which is in German. We got a few German readers and speakers here. It's a little bit of a double entendre. Der Judenstaat could be translated as the Jewish state, or the Jew state, or the state of the Jews. And of course, even when you think about that, the English is a little bit clumsy. But the Jewish state suggests it's going to be Jewish in some core way. The state of the Jews, or the Jew state, that suggests it's going to be Jewish only to the extent that it's Jews who are doing it, which then leaves open the question of, okay, so what's Jewish about it? And this is a line from the novel: while we respect our rabbis, we'll keep them to their synagogues, just as the army will be kept to its barracks. In other words, this will not be a theocracy. Now, Herzl was respectful. Some people are cynical about his respectfulness, but when he goes to Basel in 1897, he's very careful. He wants to make sure there's a kosher restaurant, so religious Jews can eat there. He also visits the synagogue on the Shabbat prior to the opening of the Congress, and he gets an aliyah, and he writes in his tag book, his diary, how moved he was at that experience. And maybe most famously and interestingly, when his train gets to Jerusalem, when Shabbat is coming in 1897, he doesn't ride in a carriage to where he was staying, because he thought it was disrespectful to Shabbat and to traditional Jews. So even though he wasn't feeling well at the time, he gets out and he walks. So he has a sense of Jewish propriety, particularly in the public sphere. In the novel, he has Zionism really introduced by a simple, modest, wonderful rabbi, not the bad Dr. Geyer, but the good rabbi, Dr. Weiss, a simple rabbi from Moravia, right? A part of what then became Czechoslovakia. There is a Seder in the story that takes place in Tiberia and Tiberias, and there they read the traditional Haggadah, and they read a kind of a modern reworking of the Haggadah that tells the story of the new exodus of immigrants who are coming in the contemporary time to the Alt-Neuland. He draws a picture of what he thinks Jerusalem will look like. It will be the capital, it will be the seat of the legislature, the academy will be there. The Sabbath is evidently dwelling in people's hearts, so Shabbat is taken seriously. And this is a picture of a contemporary Pesach on a kibbutz. Notice, of course, people, their heads are not covered. This is probably a secular kibbutz, but Passover obviously is a major holiday. But the most interesting thing about the novel in terms of the Jewish cultural religious piece is that the temple has been rebuilt. And there are all kinds of Jewish symbols from the Torah that he puts in there. The Yachin and Boaz, these two pillars, the Sea of Copper, as in olden days when Melech Shlomo HaMelech ruled the land. But no korbanot, no animal sacrifices, and no priestly cult. So even though he's very focused on a certain level of Jewish symbolism and imagery and even institutions, he only goes so far with that. Okay, what's the social contract of religion and state in the book? And this is what you will recognize from contemporary Israel. Religion has a certain kind of power in the public sphere, in terms of things like the Jewish calendar being taken seriously, Shabbat, the holidays, and the like. And yet, individuals, which is what we would recognize from the United States, individuals have freedom of religion and freedom from religion. So even though I didn't put a picture up on here, of course, if I were to show you a picture from Tel Aviv on a Saturday, what would be one of the pictures that I could show you? The beach. People flocking to the beach, to the Mediterranean. And they can't get there by public transportation. So that's a part of the whole public-private thing. There's no civil marriage, which drives a lot of people crazy, meaning marriage is on some level controlled by the Misrat HaRabbanut, the official rabbinate, and yet a little bit less well known. There's the acceptance by the state and courts of cohabitation, common law marriage, and prenuptial agreements. So in other words, the rabbis have a lot of power over people's personal lives in terms of marriage and divorce, but there are certain workarounds that have, sort of evolved down through the years. And of course, the status quo, which this picture only imperfectly shows, was really, of course, this creation of Ben Gurion and the Chazon Ish, a famous Lithuanian rabbi, this idea that said there should be a kind of an agreement between the religious parties and the state so that religion would be respected. And Shlomo Avineri, a political scientist, wrote that the real essence of the social contract between religious parties and non-religious parties is that everyone is unhappy. Namely, if you ask a religious Jew in Israel, is the society religious enough for you? They would say no. And if you ask a secular Jew, is the society secular enough? They would also say no, and it's in that shared unhappiness that you get happiness, right? So that's really the status quo, right? That there was going to be a certain amount of protection for religious life, especially after the Holocaust, that Ben Gurion was very sensitive to, both for historical and sentimental reasons, as well as for political reasons, as well as for the fact that he thought the folks on the left would be a tiny little inconsequential element in Israeli society. Therefore, he was happy to mollify them. But of course, the other thing that he missed would be the growth of religious Zionists, those fellows on the right, who are modern Jews wearing kippot. Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was one of the great Jewish philosophers of the State of Israel, he wrote this wonderful book called Judaism, Human Values in the Jewish State. He worried about the extent to which the social contract really encouraged a blending of religion and state. He was really a Western thinker. He would have been very much at home in some ways in the United States, in the sense that he regarded it as a secular state living in concubinage with religion, meaning he didn't like the extent to which there was an official Judaism, because he thought the state would corrupt Judaism, and he thought Judaism would corrupt the state. So he really didn't like the social contract that Avineri was talking about. Of course, what has changed to challenge that kind of that social contract that Avineri talked about? Number one is you got a lot more Haredim. They make a lot of babies. What at one time was a pretty insignificant demographic reality in the society has become much more significant. And they've become much more aggressive. This is actually a picture of them demonstrating against Sabbath desecration. Some of us have seen or been a part of demonstrations where they would go out to street corners, certain neighborhoods, not so far from Hebrew University, Mount Scopus and French Hill, Ramat Eshkol, where they would sort of throw rocks at people driving by, right? They see it as a kind of an invasion of their own space, but they're an increasingly politicized, aggressive element in the Israeli polity, and of course, to the extent they have greater numbers, they're much more aggressive. So on the one hand, you have Haredim making many more demands of the political system, which I mentioned. On the other hand, and they're also doing things like demanding separate seating on buses, public buses. So they're much more out there about their demands. Religious Zionist forces have also become much more significant in terms of things like the army. Here's a kind of a funky picture of something that is a wonderful sight in my judgment, which is a kind of a religious pluralism in Israel, a woman davening with talis and tefillin. But you have this phenomenon now of what I called here action and reaction. You have radical secular forces that in some ways have organized themselves as the Haredim have become more militant, secular forces have become more militant as well. And so what you have is a certain kind of very stark anti-clericalism. And the thing that is, I think, concerning about this is that for a state that has survived on compromise and halfway measures, Israel in some ways is becoming more Balkanized around issues of religion, the Haredim versus the secular, and that begins to look a lot more like the diaspora model, where you have communities that really don't communicate very well with each other, and they don't really recognize each other as legitimate. And that's a real concern, because, of course, the irony is that the whole point of Israel and Zionism was to create a single civic authority that would create a functioning, effective, powerful unity of the Jewish people, right? And this trajectory would seem to suggest that that unity is sort of breaking apart a little bit. So that's those three things: the vision of a Jewish and democratic state, the vision of a social and economic world that is both hospitable to enterprise and innovation, but also equality and fairness, and a state where all Jews would feel comfortable, that would be deeply Jewish in a variety of different ways. All those things, it seems to me, face challenges. But you could argue that the meta message of the book, which is encoded in Herzl's probably his most famous phrase, at least in the Hebrew, Im tirtzu ein zu agada, if you will, it is no dream. Of course, the meta message of Zionism was Jews can build this. They can make this happen. They can own their history. They can make history. That is what has happened. And as long as we continue to approach history in the contemporary world with that same spirit of activism, hopefully Jews can continue to work through these very challenging aspects of Israeli life.